Good morning to everybody here and also to our participants who are joining us online. Welcome back. I hope that you got a little bit of rest after last night's interesting debates and dinner, and that you maybe had a walk on the beach. A reminder not to go too deep because of the sharks, but it's a lovely walk for those who are able to wake up early. So yesterday, very quickly, yesterday we focused, especially through the breakout groups, on analysis, right? We identified some of the key challenges, many of the key challenges in facing the triple planetary crisis. And we also started talking about some of the main gaps and inconsistencies in the existing global governance system. And today we're going to start diving into the design of solutions. So we're going to start with an excellent panel today with some new guests as well, both here and online. And I'm going to hand the mic over to Fernanda Carvalho from WWF, who will be our moderator, with a quick reminder, by the way, that we have coffee here behind me. So feel free to grab a little bit more caffeine as we proceed. So Fernanda, over to you. Thank you. Obrigada.
Yeah, I was looking for her because she's one of our distinguished panelists of this morning. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, moderating this panel. I'll try to do my best to stick to the moderator role because I tend to want to speak on issues as well, but I'll try not to. And this is a panel that's very, very interesting because it's the role of the UN and the triple planetary crisis, the role of the Global South. And, you know, we are in the Global South, and I am from the Global South. So I find this issue quite exciting. When we talk about the Global South, we're talking about a whole diversity of countries. We have very diverse countries. Some of them have to deal with, or I should say, exercise a colonial past. These are some of the challenges we deal with. We are also vulnerable countries, not only from an environmental perspective, but from a social and economic perspective, very much from a political perspective. You see what's going on in countries like Brazil, like Peru. So those are some of the challenges, but we also hold some of the solutions. For example, the natural resources, the so-called nature-based solutions we talk about in the biodiversity and the climate change debate. We have mineral resources that the world needs for its unsustainable ways, but also for the sustainable ways for the energy transition. And we have indigenous populations and local communities that can contribute with their traditional knowledge. So I would invite the panelists to consider that and talk to us and think outside the box when we discuss the role of the Global South. And our first panelist is Ambassador Thilmeeza Hussain. She's the representative, the permanent representative for the Maldives, from the Maldives for the UN. And I would also remind my panelists here that we have 10 minutes. Please try to stick to the time so we can have fruitful discussions just like we had yesterday. So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, and a very good morning. And I hope you all had a restful night. First of all, allow me to also thank the organizers for the very warm welcome and the kind hospitality in your beautiful country, and also for Plataforma SIPO, Adriana and Mayara, for the excellent arrangements, as well as Global Challenges Foundation, Stimson Center, FEPS, Heinrich-Böll Foundation, for the wonderful, for bringing this amazing group of people together to have these rich discussions that we are having. I think yesterday was an excellent day. We had, it was very thought-provoking, and I am deeply honored to be here and to be able to be amongst you to have this discussion. Friends, I come from the Maldives, which is a small island nation, a country that stands at the forefront of the triple planetary crisis. As a small, vulnerable country that is dependent on our natural resources, our environment, for our sustenance and livelihood and security, for us, the stakes for us on this discussion could not be higher, and it could not be understated. So this is why you have seen Maldives at the forefront of the UN efforts to address planetary crisis from very early days. And I'd like to spend a moment to trace the thread back for you. In 1980s, we experienced increasing floods in our country, and in 1987, I was 10 years old maybe. But I still remember the capital city, Malé, we were living, and it was inundated with floods, and much of the city was destroyed. And people were putting sandbags outside to stop the floods from coming inside the house. So it caused extensive damage. And although at that time climate change science was still in infancy stage in terms of global dialogues, the link between greenhouse gas emissions and rise in global temperatures and consequently the sea level rise was being made, but it was not increasingly talked about. And though these challenges were there, and particularly countries like mine were already experiencing these challenges even back then, it was not discussed in the global stage as extensively as it is discussed today. But back in 1980s, then the government of Maldives invited 14 small countries to come to Maldives, and then we had a conference which was called 14 Ministers from Small Island States came to Maldives in 1989. And we also invited scientists and observers to come, and then we had a discussion about threats of global warming and sea level rise that pose to small island states, and the need for the broadest possible international cooperation to manage this crisis. And we came up with a declaration which was called Malé Declaration. And I'm going to read a quote from the declaration. In the light of scientific consensus regarding the likelihood of climate change and global warming, and deeply concerned over the change in global environment and its possible adverse effects, particularly the threat of sea level rise, the small island states gathered here declared their intent to work, collaborate, and seek international cooperation to protect the low-lying, small, coastal, and island states of the world from the dangers posed by climate change, global warming, and sea level rise. It's astonishing in some ways and very depressing, actually. We are still negotiating and discussing these same threats 30 years later. The Malé Declaration subsequently led to the formation of Alliance of Small Island States, and through AOSIS, a lot of small island states were instrumental in bringing the framework of the Kyoto together, Kyoto Protocol, the first global climate agreement together, and we have been very actively engaged in the multilateral level in climate action. And more recently, last year, both in Geneva and in New York, Maldives was a part of the core group of countries that led to the adoption of a resolution on the right to a healthy environment. We also created a group of friends on marine plastic pollution, helped push UNIA resolution to launch a process to agree to an international treaty on plastic pollution just in the past couple of years. As a small country, this expansive diplomatic engagement and we spent tremendous resources and expenses, political capital, on addressing the issues of trying to bring world attention to highlight on the challenges climate change and triple planetary crisis poses to our small island countries. And the global governance response to address this nexus still remain very, very weak and fragmented. Why is that? One answer lies in how we initially conceived of these various regimes in silos. The linkages between human rights and environment have been made more explicit in recent years, yet we address human rights in Geneva, and then we talk about development issues in New York, and we have traditionally siloed our climate regime and biodiversity regime, and of course I understand that there's a need for in-depth discussions that each of these regimes deserve, but at the same time there is also important, I think it's very important that these issues are addressed in a more integrated fashion, because when we discuss these issues in silos, the governments, the ministries, the civil society organizations align themselves accordingly to these silos, and then we're not having a holistic discussion around these issues. Yet, as among the smallest of countries, we persist on moving the global community to connect these issues. And when we had the presidency of General Assembly last year, Maldives Foreign Minister placed an important role on highlighting the significance of multilateralism and why it is so important for small island countries, why we need, what is at stake when we try to fragment the multilateral system and question the inefficiency of multilateral system. Of course, it has its flaws, but it is the multilateral system that we are dependent on to address these issues and try to find global solutions instead of each country doing their own tidbit and whatever they want to do without making any global commitments and without everyone coming together. So it's important to ensure that the multilateral system stays together, and we don't let people cherry pick and destroy the multilateral system, because as small countries we rely on this multilateral system, and we need to work on strengthening the multilateral system, the governance of the multilateral system, the governance of the climate regime. There are a lot of flaws in it, but we do need to make sure that we keep the multilateral system intact. So why do we put so much energy into this? The answer is obvious. The scientists and our experience show that the only way to secure our future is to ensure that the system works. We have been off track to achieve the how many minutes left? 2 minutes, okay. Okay. We have been off track to achieve the 2-degree target. We have been off track in achieving the financial gaps that is there, commitments that has been made, and in this complicated world, we need to find a way to make progress while recognizing our differences, and we need to be constructive and not weaponize climate and sustainable development agenda into one where sides need to be picked, or because we can't be fracturing the multilateral system. We have to work in bringing, of course we need to highlight the flaws, but we really need to work to strengthen it and to find commonalities where we can come together and work as a global community, because the challenges that we face are not challenges that can be addressed by one single country or one single community. We need to come as a global community to face these challenges. I want to talk a little bit about finances, the amount of finances that is required for adaptation and loss and damage and so many other issues that we have been discussing here, but I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave it at that and pass the floor to my good friend here. David, is it? Oh no, David's not the speaker. Okay,
but that's fine.
So I'll let the moderator pass the floor then.
Thank you very much for keeping to the time. Hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion here, so we'll be able to address those points that you weren't able to talk about in detail. But I think the talk was very interesting and engaging, because I think the Maldives, we that work on climate change look at the Maldives very much. And I think the story you told about the conference in 1989 relates very much to what we have been discussing yesterday. It's been 30 years we're trying to address the problems. We know what the problems are, and of course, multilateralism is the way to do it. But if you like, we have been doing things business as usual. It's time to innovate, and that's our challenge here. So now I give the floor to Dr. Adam Day. He's the head of the Geneva office of the UN University Center for Policy Research. He oversees programming on a lot of issues from peace building to climate security and global governance, so I'm sure he'll make a very interesting contribution to our debate. Adam, please.
Thanks so much. And it's really great to follow Ambassador Hussain. I was actually scribbling down ways to shift my comments to incorporate some of those great points. I wanted to speak specifically from our role as the Secretariat for the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, which has been tasked by the Secretary General to come up with ways of improving global governance, including around environmental governance. I don't speak for the board, so this is not a kind of official summary of what they're considering. Their report's not out yet, but I do want to give a sense of some of the proposals that have been put forward in the consultations that the board's done, some of the most interesting ideas that can get to some of the key question of this session, which is really also about involving the Global South and meeting their needs in climate response. And I've got 6 points in 6 minutes, which hopefully will lead to a discussion with all of you. This is not meant to answer any of the questions. I think the first point is really the moment that we've reached where we don't talk about people and planet separately, where we don't talk about sustainable development and environmental issues as a separate issue, but we treat them as an issue together. So it's about reaching balance with the planet and finding energy for the 800 million people that don't have access to electricity. And I think the big message of today and what you see coming out of Greta in the WEF and the minds in Germany is really that those countries and people who are least responsible for climate change can't be made to bear the burden of the transition to green energy today. And we're in a great place to think about that in Recife, and the Maldives is a wonderful example of that, a frightening example of that, really. But the concept of differentiated responsibilities needs to go beyond that narrow loss and damage realm and be scaled up to all mitigation and adaptation activities. And that's the kind of topic of the moment that has reached COP and has certainly been part of the high-level advisory board's discussions. The second has to do with the level of ambition and the targets that we're trying to set and what the SG calls a breakthrough moment might look like. And so setting those targets around net zero, carbon pledges, ending the fossil fuel era and paying for it, ending fossil fuel subsidies, agreeing on a specific set of net positive biodiversity targets, committing to net zero deforestation by a specific date, and similarly for a pollution-free planet. I think that package of ambition needs to be consolidated, and I think the term Greta used yesterday was to be put in blood. I wouldn't use such a powerful metaphor, but some sort of commitment that is consolidated into something that can be tracked and lead to accountability. The third area is the major proposals around financing, and I'd be really keen to hear what Ambassador Hussain has to say about that. But I think what you see out of the Bridgetown Initiative, the Fair Share Initiative, is an ambition around public and private capital generation, de-risking, repurposing the international financial institutions to address this crisis more directly. And I think the real question is if the Bretton Woods institutions were designed around post-World War II reconstruction, what is the moment today that they need to be redesigned around? And I think there's some real moments and opportunities around there. And to think of this concept of global public goods as it's an economic term, but as something that could be the focus of the international financial architecture. The fourth is really how to bring a broader range of actors into environmental governance. And the plastics treaty that's being negotiated right now is very interesting because industry is actually directly involved in those discussions. Catherine McKenna's net zero report talked about the obligations and the incorporation of non-state actors into that net zero pledge in a more meaningful way. There's a very open question around special status for cities who are often on the front line of environmental governance. And there are also lots of ideas around putting more democratic processes into environmental governance. One of the great terms we heard was ending the tyranny of the minority, which would, that currently allows 1 or 2 states to block consensus agreements on the environment. Are there ideas like a weighted majority voting system within environmental governance that could unlock and unblock that problem? Certainly getting beyond the kind of classic metaphor of the mahogany table where all the decisions are made, and thinking about distributed democratic decision making as the future of environmental governance is a big question that's being grappled with right now in these discussions. I think fifth is something actually that Ambassador Hussain raised around this idea of siloing, and how you've got the IPCC and the IPBES and the IPCP, these other silos where specific impacts on the environment are thought through and dealt with. Certainly some sort of consolidated view of the impact that we're having on the planet as a whole, some sort of science policy action network that could look at the planetary thresholds together, what Ambassador Hussain called a holistic discussion. I would say that needs to be linked to a holistic response as well. But there's a lot of discussion about how that could be brought together institutionally. And then another question about how knowledge and technology could be transferred more equitably globally, so that the technology around green energy and green industry is not just the purview of the global north. Certainly this would require re-examining IP issues and potentially TRIPS. And also, I think, meaningful commitments to preserving and transferring indigenous knowledge around the environment. And I'd love to hear from this group if they have ideas on how that could be done. The sixth area that is being considered really is exactly what Ambassador Hussain spoke of when she talks about strengthening the multilateral system. There's a package of ideas around elevating the environment in the multilateral system. We still have a set of structures that were designed in the 1970s around UNEP and the Environmental Assembly, where it is kind of siloed, to use that term again, but to understand that the environment cuts across the 3 main pillars of the UN system: development, human rights, and peace and security, and how that recent right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment could be used to elevate the environment across the system. So that could have to do with bolstering UNEP and UNEA as an institution. It could have to do with linking them and integrating it more with the IFIs, and helping shape the normative and practical discourse around some of the most important issues that are coming up now, like climate altering technologies, and how to address the prospects and the risks of them is certainly one of the important places where a global governance discussion needs to happen. There are lots of really ambitious proposals. I think I'm almost out of time. I have 2 minutes, great. There are lots of really ambitious proposals that have been put forward by other actors, ideas of a World Environmental Council or a World Environmental Court that would oversee and regulate some of these rights. I think that would be a really interesting discussion to hear from all of you, what you think the prospect of it is. But I mean, overall, many of these 6 issues could be seen as a kind of package. In the past, they've talked about a pact for people and planet. But certainly, I think the key is to offer a real value proposition to the North, also global North, for investing in the just transition, just green transition, not just because it's the right thing to do in principle, but it's the only way and the best investment in the immediate, in the long term. And I think that if you look in the US and the Inflation Reduction Act, we see a way in which large-scale investment in sustainable energy can help reduce the price, bring it down onto a trajectory towards net zero. And I think Ambassador Hussain again talked about getting out of the picking sides approach. We think we phrased it as getting out of the zero-sum approach and thinking of the just transition as a win-win, and not as someone has to pay for something else per se. Final point is that the process of the high-level advisory board is not done yet. The report is not done. There are many inflection points. The report will come out in April, but you've got the World Bank meetings in the spring. You've got a UN ministerial in September around the Our Common Agenda report. You've got COP28, and then the kind of summit of the future, which will be in September 2024, which many of the tracks that are in the common agenda and that are in these environmental discussions will come together. And so this is really an open door to get your ideas and to try to feed them into these processes. And I'm really delighted to be here. I should have started by thanking the organizers for bringing us here. But this is exactly the kind of group that can give us new and ambitious ideas to feed to this board. And they are very committed to listening to all of you. And I think some of them are indeed listening in on the webinar as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for bringing those 6 points. I think they're very, very key. People and the planet together, ambitious targets, financing initiatives, both public and private, for planet reconstruction, if you like, including actors and democratic processes. A mahogany table, it's a very timely metaphor because mahogany is a resource from the south and it's an endangered species. The trade is no longer possible. And also breaking silos, which is something that we need to do with knowledge transfer and considering the knowledge of indigenous peoples and local communities, and of course strengthening the multilateral system. That's why we need to think out of the box, and we have to discuss concepts. For example, this concept of public goods or global public goods, is a complicated one. All of us that have been discussing this for a while know about it, but very interesting points. And now I pass to my colleague here, David Obura. He is the founding director of CORDIO East Africa, a knowledge organization. He's also an Earth Commissioner from the Earth Commission, and he's also an IPBES member. I just learned yesterday. So over to you, David, please.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, and I'll also start by thanking the organizers for convening this really interesting discussion and session, and for bringing me here to be a part of it. I'm here sort of through the Earth Commission, as Fernanda has just mentioned, and what I'll try and do is just provide an overview of some of our results. We're a scientific body, or a group of scientists that has been convened under the Global Commons Alliance to really look at this challenge of planetary boundaries and how can we address them, both from the scientific side, but then also from action in terms of real responses and governance responses as well to addressing them. We've taken up, so Johan Rockström is one of the co-chairs of the Earth Commission, as is Jyoita Gupta, a justice scholar, and Da He Kin from the Chinese Academy of Science. Now, the approach that we've taken has been to take the planetary boundary concept and add the dimension of justice. And we talk about Earth system boundaries. It's a bit more of a technical term, and I'll go through some of that. And we're really looking at tipping elements in the Earth system, so critical major systems such as ice sheets in the cryosphere, ocean circulation, major ecosystems such as the Amazon rainforest and basin and coral reefs. And in looking at what we can address from a scientific basis, we identified 5 main systems. So climate, biodiversity, and nutrient pollution are 3 of those, and those align with the triple planetary crisis, so provide a connection to the topics we're discussing here. But then we also considered others, so air pollution as well, and fresh water. I won't go into those in any detail. And I think this makes a point that I'll come back to from an IPBES perspective, is that the triple planetary crisis is really an example of the polycrises that we're dealing with, and the importance of thinking beyond the specifics of these 3 elements to really design a robust system. Now, in the Earth Commission, this is the first quantitative scientific foundation for safeguarding the global commons for all people now and into the future. We have used the concept of a safe and just framing, where we've defined safe as ensuring a stable, resilient biophysical conditions on Earth, like those of the last 10,000 years, that have allowed humans or humanity to prosper in the societal development that has led up to today. And then just is defined as minimizing human exposure to significant harm from Earth system change and ensuring access to resources for a dignified life and escape from poverty for everyone. This aligns very closely with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. The justice elements are important, and it's quite complex. In doing that, there's some complex scholarship has gone into this, looking at 3 main elements of justice. It's worth mentioning them. So interspecies justice, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. And the latter, intragenerational, splits into many forms that we're dealing with currently in the global system, so international, community, intersectional justice. And this corresponds to many of the elements that from the breakout groups yesterday that the Justice Group mentioned in their reporting back. And an important point is that thinking about the just boundaries on the Earth system is many of them are more stringent than the safe boundaries, and I'll go into this in some detail. Now, just a quick summary of the Earth system boundaries that we have quantified. Now, we have two major papers coming out now, still in review in Nature, the journal, and in the Lancet, so we're not able to report them all fully. But our co-chairs were at the World Economic Forum and did a presentation on Wednesday. I've provided a sheet with some links to that presentation and some of the key resources that we have. So I've asked the organizers to circulate that to everyone so you can look at that. And I do encourage you to watch that presentation that they made because it's about 12 minutes at the beginning of the session. It's quite short. They really go through the technical details of what we have covered very well. So on the climate side, we have used temperature as the key variable that we're looking at. And that identified that the safe threshold for temperature is 1.5 degrees Celsius. This aligns with the IPCC findings very well. And there are 5 Earth systems that the science says may tip shortly after 1.5 degrees Celsius into a different state that has consequences on other Earth systems and on people. So these are the Greenland, the West Antarctic ice sheets, the Labrador-Erminger Sea convection, so this is in the North Atlantic convection and ocean currents, Barents Sea ice, and coral reefs, all are projected to tip into an alternate state that they may not be able to recover from past 1.5 degrees warming. The Amazon rainforest is in the next tier of risk in terms of Earth systems, and that's between 2 and 3.7 Celsius warming is the risk of the Amazon basin tipping into a non-rainforest system. And I won't go into the details of that because, of course, it is quite complex. But the important point here is that thinking about just climate boundaries, the just boundary is less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's with the working group looking at this has set it at 1 degree Celsius, which we have already passed. And that makes the point that many vulnerable communities, countries are already facing harmful impact from climate change at levels that we're facing today. Now, on biodiversity, which is the one that I worked on with colleagues, we identified 2 components. One is the coverage of intact ecosystems on terrestrial Earth surface. We weren't able to deal with the oceans yet. So intact ecosystems need to cover between 50 and 60% of the Earth's surface to maintain the safe system that we know to date. We're currently at slightly less than 50% of intact ecosystems. So these are ecosystems functioning with a very high levels of natural function, not necessarily completely pristine. Some of these are, of course, impacted to a degree, and there is some use of them in many parts of the world. And then on those parts of the Earth system or the terrestrial surface that are past natural systems that can't be recognized as functioning natural systems anymore, so this is about 40 to 50% of the land surface, we've identified on the basis of nature's contributions to people that more than 25% per square kilometer of these areas need to have functioning ecosystems that provide benefits to people. So once you get below that 25% of natural vegetation at the local scale per square kilometer, you lose functions that people benefit from. And that means things like pollination, pest and disease control, fresh water quality regulation, soil protection, natural hazards regulation such as landslides. So what we did was we went through the literature and we looked at the local scales within a distance of it from several hundred meters to a few kilometers, on what scales do people get these benefits and what amount of natural vegetation or semi-natural vegetation is required to provide these benefits to people. And this identifies both of these, the intact and the integrity of natural ecosystems, or ecosystems provide the safe and just boundaries for people. We also did this for pollution, for nitrogen and phosphorus levels, and there are quantities for that. But the important thing about what we did with this that I feel it's very useful from a Global South perspective is that we provided a very strong interdisciplinary scientific basis for many of the elements that many are already talking about in social spheres or development spheres or in rights-based spheres about how we should be managing and what limits there are in natural systems that are needed for people to live a dignified life, to escape from poverty. And this is really linking that very strongly with the natural sciences that support this process. So providing additional weight to the arguments that are needed for justifying responses that we should have. So now coming out from that, I'll just make three main observations, and this is more of a personal framing about why this is useful. I think one is about, in the multilateral system and supporting multilateralism, is the importance of alignment and coordination and how we do that. And I think I believe, and we've said this yesterday in our working group a bit, the Sustainable Development Goals provide very strong principles for supporting alignment. It's a very complicated world that we live in. It's very hard to coordinate everything from a central process, and these large institutions providing coordination have a lot of challenges doing that. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals identify there are principles that can apply across all those goals of critical assets and outcomes that are identified as being necessary for sustainable development for all people. And the principle there is that you should do no harm across the goals and ideally seek synergies and positive co-benefits across goals. And that these can scale from local to global levels as well. I think that's very important for Global South context because it really enables the local context to drive decision-making and solution setting rather than impositions from above. And if you try and imagine the alignment across these large institutions, I work in the IPBES process. I've been a little bit involved in IPCC and been to the climate and biodiversity COPs. This discussion of should there be a single COP or should these all be coordinated together, the complexity of issues that they're dealing with are so high, and the sciences that are the foundations for these systems are so different that there's certainly an area of overlap between them, but how much should that overlap be? And is it that we can, sorry. So that's my own timer. So how can we identify the way to coordinate across these elements? We're addressing this in the IPBES Nexus assessments, and I'll put in a plug for that, partly because we're actually going through our first open review process right now. So I'm one of the 3 co-chairs on that report, and it's really looking at the nexus between climate, biodiversity, water, food, and health. So again, our framing of the poly crisis, and we're trying to make it generic so that you could look at different types of crises, identify different response options that actors could take from different perspectives. So please do sign up. They've provided links on the sheet, whether yourselves or experts in your systems, to provide your perspectives on what you think this report should address and how well we have addressed those in the chapters so far. There'll be a second review process at the end of this year, beginning of next year.
2 minutes.
I'll have 2 more minutes. Thank you very much. So, and I think the last point that I'll make is around the aspects of biodiversity and climate together. Now, I think and I was part of the IPBES IPCC workshop report, and we've had some discussions about the importance of the strengths of IPCC and IPBES are in the plenary processes that they have. There are many who criticize the summary for policymakers as political documents. You have the science that is done in the main assessment reports. What the summary for policymakers provide is an opportunity for the scientists and the policymakers to sit down together and really talk through the details of what this report is about. And so we get to sit with the policymakers for a week and defend our scientific positions. And there's a point at which we will say, well, we won't cross a certain boundary in terms of the language that we can use. And if we can get to an agreement, then that language goes into the summary for policymakers. If it doesn't, then we don't cross that red line. The information is still in the assessment. It just doesn't make it into the summary for policymakers. And so these documents are very important as a negotiation process between science and policy together. Biodiversity and climate both needs those. One of the key issues of connection between the two is the nature-based solutions, and it's one of my great disappointments in the biodiversity sphere is that the language on nature-based solutions has been so captured by climate that we don't really get to see that actually, especially in developing countries, so much of what people benefit, or the assets that people have, are natural systems, whether it's for food, for water, for health, for recreation. And so nature is a solution for almost everything in developing country context. So nature-based solutions really need to be adopted and not just held in the climate space, but held between these two. And so I think I'll finish with that then. Thank you.
Thank you so much for only going over 2 minutes, 46 seconds. But yeah, that was a great talk. Thanks for bringing the science to the table. As we mentioned yesterday, this is key. This is very, very important. Talking about planetary boundaries and Earth systems change, the alignment with SDGs and Agenda 2030. Thanks for bringing also the justice dimensions. I think that's very, very important. And the discussion about solutions, the role of nature-based solutions. I agree very much that their role is much broader than you know, just climate. So now I have two discussants, and it's great because they have the opportunity to also contribute to this very brilliant panel. We had a very live experience from the Maldives. We have the science here, and also the discussion on how to improve multilateralism. So I'll give the floor to Dr. Imme Scholz. She's the president of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung Foundation and co-president of the report on sustainable development, global sustainable development 2023. So over to you, Dr. Scholz. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, I see the thumbs up.
We can hear and see you very well.
Okay. I really would have liked to join you in Recife and listening to your presentations and also to the references to yesterday. I think I would have benefited a lot from sharing that time yesterday with you too. And it would have benefited also the GSDR, the Global Sustainable Development Report, which we are in the final stages of drafting and which will be launched at the SDG Summit in September in New York. And actually, the joint IPBES IPCC workshop report was a reference for us when we started our discussions. And much of what has been said now by David also went through our minds, and also the emphasis Ambassador Thilmeeza Hussain put on abolishing the siloed approach, silo thinking, and actively engaging with the interlinkages between rights and solutions, so to say. When listening to you, I thought that these the perspectives brought across by the panelists cover many areas which are absolutely crucial for dealing with the triple planetary crisis in a way that human development is promoted globally while staying or achieving peace with nature. And this is also mirrored in the GSDR, and I use the opportunity to share a little bit of it with you because I understand that the SDG Summit and the Summit for the Future in 2024 are both crucial opportunities for advancing the type of solutions you want to focus on today, and to do that in two ways: by improving multilateral action, multilateral coordination and compromise, so strengthen that. And that's why I understand also our Common Agenda report as pointing out where multilateralism is weak and what opportunities would be to strengthen it, but at the same time recommitting national action to engage in this too. And I think that and to have rekindle the understanding that the 2030 agenda and the SDGs are meant to break down the silos, to understand what we today call the polycrisis, but also to make sure that no solution will be viable and feasible and produce lasting results if it's not linked to human rights and if it's not linked to local contexts. And I think that this is not always clear in neither national deliberations nor multilateral ones. I was wondering when I saw the program, the concept of this meeting, I thought it is great that to have this conference where the Global South speaks about the stakes it has in this situation, but also the solutions it wants to propose and promote. I think this voice is extremely important to hear, and I thank you for being able to listen, because I will also circulate it in the circles I belong to. And it certainly matches very well with the approach in the foundation, in the Heinrich-Böll Foundation, to work in partnership and to decolonize multilateral and cooperation relations. What I also thought is, what is the we are in, or you are in Brazil. I would have liked to be in Brazil too with you. I lived there for many years. But what we know is that Brazil will be the G20 president next year. And I think, and this year we have India in the presidency, and the year after it's South Africa. I think it is an opportunity for the Global South to have these consecutive presidencies in a club. The G20 is a club, but it's a special club because it combines 80% of most population of GDP, but also of problem-solving approaches, but not the majority of countries. So it is a responsibility, I think, and an opportunity of the G20 to use its meetings for identifying how it can contribute to strengthening multilateralism. Not club governance, but as a smaller group, contribute to the strengthening of multilateral approaches and solutions. And I think it would make a lot of sense to bring the key results of this process to these three presidencies, actually, and challenge them to make a positive contribution to creating the necessary support so that we have concrete outputs of the SDG summit and the summit for the future. So that would be one of my, in the way of thinking about solutions and gearing processes towards and using platforms for solutions as one possibility. And probably my time has run out, but just let me say two sentences again about the GSDR. What we have thought about is, why is it so difficult to make progress with the transformations that are embedded in the SDGs that the 2030 agenda stands for? And what we want to focus on there is to understand the dynamics of transformation processes, the impediments and the resistances it generates, and how to move forward from the emergence of solutions through an acceleration process and then stabilize the new pathways which lead us to more sustainability. And this is mainly thought from the perspective of national action, but it is always intertwined with the support of international and multilateral cooperation and action. And it absolutely has to be context specific. So it has to include the local level as well. So we hope that the GSDR with this approach can also feed into the ongoing process here of the triple planetary crisis and yeah, I hope that this was helpful for your ongoing thinking process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scholz. I also wish you were in Brazil with us because you brought so many interesting points. So you're welcome to come anytime. I think when you talk about multilateral action, coordination and compromise, the point on compromise is very, very important because we forget about this. We think that the institutional context works by itself, but it's the compromise that holds it together. I think the point of recommitting national action with international support is key. We discussed that yesterday, that you have the decisions taken at the international context and at country level, and not only at the country level, you go back to subnational level and to various actors to implement that, and for bringing the important opportunity of the G20 presidencies. And I'm looking forward to the GSDR, since you mentioned you're focusing on new pathways. That was great. Thank you very much. And our next commenter, I am commenting the commenters, but you invited me to moderate, so that's what you get. And we have Juan Fernando Lucio Lopez, the director of at One Earth Future Foundation, Paso, Colombia. He's an economist, so he's going to bring yet a different perspective to this discussion. Looking forward to hear you.
Hello? Yeah, I think it works. So, first of all, let me thank Richard Ponzio for having invited me to this amazing conference, and as well as the other organizers, to Michael, to Magnus Jayborn, to Adriana, to the Sheeple platform. Definitely, it's been a pleasure to see and to be together here in Recife, which is such an amazing city. Listening to you, I wanted to also say that I feel that I've learned tremendously, or I'm learning tremendously from this conference. And meeting people with the commitment and experience as you all are gives me hope that we will be in a much better shape in the year 2030, for sure. Now, I think that a lot of this discussion focuses on the issue of multilateralism and how to make it better. And that's why I would like to provide some reflection. How much time do I have? 2 minutes? 1 minute? 5 minutes. All right. Okay. I want to raise the attention to the fact that there's probably nothing as multilateral as a market. And this is probably the crux of my reflection. I say it because it concerns us all that there is the necessity of a participation of the private sector and the idea of creating markets that can contribute to the preservation, to biodiversity, and to the solution of the climate crisis. I come from the field of peace in Colombia, and it seems to me that the problems we have been discussing about have similarities to the ones I encounter in this field. In particular, the structural rigidities that we encounter, as Mr. Jose Graciano was mentioning yesterday, and are embedded in the DNA of the system, right? This reminds me a little bit of the discussion and of the thinking of Aristotle, that, such a long time ago, he says, to all my friends, but there is no friendship. And the inability of the human species to achieve levels of solidarity at the large scale. He says, that friendship, unfortunately, is a privilege that only happens among a few people. So, we're kind of capable of going so far as, we manage to have, very sort of strong relationships, but we only manage to have this with a small group of people. But fortunately for us, Nietzsche solves this problem and says, we can achieve agreements even if we don't care much about each other, which is a very important thing, in the topic that we're trying to discuss. And you mentioned this in the relationship North-North, and in understanding that, dealing and addressing the planetary crisis is also a matter of profit, it's also a matter of self-interest. And yet, I see that there is a big role for civil society's organization, And this is perhaps the greatest contribution of civil societies organizations, because they have been able to compensate, the deficiency that we see in large institutions for implementation and for the last mile actual delivery of the products. But going more deeply into the market situation, I think that neoclassical economics, in spite of having free markets and market economies at the center of the stage to solve the classic problem of allocation of resources, goes very little into explaining the nature of markets. The complexities of markets, but also their nuances, are often bundled behind the concept of an invisible hand. We seem to sort of, when we think of market solutions, there seems to be, in the way we were educated, that there was something like magical, something very sort of esoteric that is called the invisible hand. And in my experience, I'm already, my hair is gray, and I see that if there's something not invisible, is the hand of the market, the market is really a construct. So today, of course, we know that there is very few of that invisible hand in markets. Markets are a construct, a very lively expression of something that is innate to human societies, which is the act of exchanging. Thus, we can argue that since the beginning of history, markets are in the nature of exchanging. Today, we know that in the science of markets, we can distinguish them according to particular features: liquidity, depth, and transparency. And some of the problems that we face today regarding the use of markets is that, every market as it begins, most of the products by definition are illiquid. So they don't have buyers and sellers. And so when we think, for instance, about the intervention of banks and banking, we have to understand that banks are not only interested in buying the assets, but on having liquidity in order to resell the assets and in order to liberate their capital. This is in the rule of things, and we need to be able to be mindful about these things. So markets are made of products too. It cannot be something that cannot be bought and sold. And the thing is that, the global public goods, we still have difficulty understanding how they can be made like product-wise, but we definitely need to work into the engineering of this. And let me tell you, if we can sell junk bonds, we can definitely sell things like nature in a way that is fair, which is also, some of the things that you have to be very mindful when you think of markets, that the whole exercise, not only is it efficient, but it is also fair, especially in the relationship between North and South. But, being in Brazil, I wouldn't be afraid, because Brazil has a very, very sophisticated market, capital market, in order to be sort of part of the solution. And there is a lot of good markets in the global South. So, and so markets are made of products, sellers, buyers, and exchanges and infrastructures, and can always be exciting and fun, which is very important for these operations, that people need to be invited, things need to flow, profits need to be made, things need to be exchanged, because we're dealing with millions of people and millions of interests and so on, and this is like the only way in which the whole the circle can be sort of turning. In the not so distant past, markets have been created through various strategies. Nature markets can be created in pretty much the same way as government securities markets were created in the 70s and 80s. It goes also back to the necessity of also sort of kind of repurposing global banking institutions like the World Bank and IMF, et cetera, to also consider more in-depth nature-based solutions. Like these markets, nature markets will require issuers, traders, and buyers. I hope one recommendation of this conference of parties consists of devising a program of market makers for diversity-conserving, climate change-preventing products. I am sure that they will meet with great demand, which is very important when we talk about markets. So, we have a very important multilateral tool that has been with us since the beginning of history, which is markets. We have with us something that we know how to do as human beings, which is exchange. We need to understand the role of this and how it can be played, and we definitely need to be on the drawing board in order to make this thing possible. So that was my comment. Thank you very much.
It's a lot for your contribution. I think, for highlighting the role of civil society, the role of markets, the invisible or non-invisible hand, and repurposing institutions, that's very, very important, and devising a program for market actors are the points that I would highlight. That's great, great conversation, great inputs. I think now it's the time that everybody was waiting for. It's when we engage our distinguished audience here for comments, suggestions, questions for the debate. Please, I'm sure there are people taking notes, willing to speak, willing to contribute. Over there, sorry. What's his name? Michael, over to you,
good
Michael.
Morning. Hi, thank you very much, Fernanda. A question specifically for David. David, that 25% per square kilometer, that is fascinating. It's very, very concrete. How common knowledge is that? Is that kind of sort of a finding that you have done through the crunching? Is it literature review? How can that be exploited more just because it's so clean, so nice, and so concrete?
Thanks, Michael. If I can. So this number was, so let me tell you a bit of the methodology. So we had a postdoc basically, did the number crunching through the literature, and she went through, so we looked at various contributions from nature to people using the IPBES frameworks. And if I can find that list, so that was pollination, pest and disease control, fresh water quality, so rainfall and capture of rain in the subsoil and things like that. And what she found was that natural or semi-natural habitat, so this can be hedgerows, it can be restored natural habitat as well. It doesn't have to be the original sort of indigenous vegetation. But this high function habitat, depending on the service you're looking at, you need from 5% up to about 25% or higher coverage of this natural vegetation within the range of access of that service. And many of these services have ranges of a few hundred meters up to 5 kilometers or something like that. So we ended up summarizing across all of these. We found that between 10 to 20 or 10 to 25% coverage per square kilometer at the local scale is needed. So if you identify a boundary, what has come up in the presentation at the World Economic Forum is this 25%. So this paper is in review, in publication right now, so it's not yet available. But of course, as soon as it is, we'll really be magnifying this message. And the value of this as a global planetary boundary is that what proportion of altered landscapes meet this proportion globally. That tells you whether we're meeting. So basically, across all altered landscapes, we want to meet this proportion of semi-natural vegetation. So yes, we'll be promoting this as soon as we're able to do it once the publications are out. And sorry, and it depends on the service. So some might be down to 5%. If you have very steep slopes, you need much higher coverage of vegetation to stop landslides than if you're on a very shallow slope and things like that. So there's a lot of variation. The local variation is critically important. The types of natural systems that you can have locally is very important.
Yeah, I agree. That is an important finding, and we want to make use of it as soon as it's published. Over to Maria João, please.
Thank you very much. So the sound is okay. Look, many thanks for this great panel, really inspiring. And I think the purpose of this conference is really extremely interesting because we are putting the priority to listen to the Global South. Well, I don't belong to the Global South, but I'm really willing to somehow provoke the discussion. And the way I put things inspiring by the panel, it seems to me is the following, is that ultimately we are looking for a kind of growl, which is how can we move to higher well-being, which should be sustainable and with more equity. For me, these are key words: sustainable well-being with equity. It's extremely difficult to combine these words. It seems to me that so far we have an important tool, which is the SDGs agenda, But we see by the other panelists that we are in trouble to implement this agenda. And one of the reasons is that in many countries, SDGs is officially the doctrine, but it's just a list of objectives. And what we need is a strategy to implement SDGs, a tailor-made strategy taking into account the specific situation of each country. So this is the first. But then, in fact, we need to have global support to SDGs. Each country should make an effort, but we need also to count on a better global framework. And there are many flaws, as the panelists were illustrating in this global governance framework. And in fact, it seems to me that we can have different scenarios. And the one we are in is called, in fact, less equity and less sustainability. I would like to have the opposite, meaning more equity and more sustainability. And we have different variations between the two. But this means that we are not in the right track. And in order to be in the right track, we should have a major rebalancing. And I think Adam referred to a very interesting insight being discussed in the high-level board when he says common and differentiated responsibilities. So far, we start translating this into loss and damage. But in fact, this principle should be also applied to adaptation and mitigation. And this would make a big, big difference, it seems to me. So I hope that the high-level board adopts this recommendation. Let's see. But my final point is exactly about Brazil. Brazil at G20. And this unique opportunity of having 3 G20 presidencies conducted by Global South. Because they can be decisive to design the global investment strategy we need to push for, to change the situation, to rebalance the way the humankind is working with the planet. I mean, when I say global investment strategy, I mean private and public, all the tools. And the only frame I can see with the strength we need to put this in motion is G20 putting pressure on Bretton Woods and working to strengthen the multilateral system. It's not against, but on the contrary, working to strengthen the multilateral system. So I stopped like that because I was, I hope, already quite provocative, but this was my intention.
So much. I have Isabella next. So if you weren't going to speak,
would you like
I
to
would
comment
prompt
and
you.
try to comment?
No,
You?
it's okay.
Are you sure?
I leave it to you. Please do a good job. Just kidding.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much for the presentation and also for the inputs. I'd like to add some comments, trying to illustrate better the challenges that we have as Global South, and also to add some comments concerning Brazil roles and how indeed I think that to have a diversity of challenges, and considering also the new mindset that we need to have to approach this huge challenge. Because I was a member of the High Left panel that proposed Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, and also I was the head of the Brazilian delegation with the president of Brazil of Rio+20 conference. So I have 2 high-level panels with the Secretary General, and also it's so complex to bring people together, even when people believe that must be come together. It's really complex, okay? And I like to match when was mentioned here that we need to understand the local context and the human rights. I fully agree. But also, I think that we need to understand better what would you like to connect. Okay, what are the critical issues must be connected? For example, human development and also human rights. When you go into a country, in developing countries like Brazil, how human development and human rights together, this is important. You go into the Amazon region, as you mentioned, go there. We have 25 million people that live in the Amazonia in Brazil, 8% in cities. Okay, so it's different when we have this approach. It's absolutely, if you try to come together with the other Amazon country basins, it's our task, it's our culture and political aspect. It's so complex because it never came together in the past. So it's very important to observe that we have a new momentum in the world, we have new geopolitical and scientific conditions in the world, because science is playing an innovative political role. It's not, I'm sorry, I'm co-chair of the International Resource Panel. So I know the challenge that we have today to bring the natural resource use as a bridge to connect IPCC and IPBES. And we produce science. We don't coordinate the scientists' papers, we produce science. So it's different when you go into this contest and try to play connecting, meaning not only developing roads, but developing roads. So everyone here agrees that the multilateral system is absolutely important and is strategic for the global crisis, and also for the planet, and also for the world. But what I'm not sure here, if you understand, like the countries are coming together today, take a deep look and check what is happening today in G77. Plus China, or minus China. When we came together because we share problems. What are the conditions for G77 today? Share solutions. When you go to discuss South-South cooperation. Nobody is discussing this. It's impressive how narrow you are when you go into the local context or political context, how we're looking for to come together as developing emerging economies. The dispute that we have today against sometimes some alliance, I use this expression between quotes, when it comes into Eastern countries and Western countries, it's really, really difficult. You know this very well. So I think that we need to understand when you go into state and non-state actors, markets, private sector, financial world, how indeed the countries are coming together. G20, it's not only India, Brazil, and South Africa. Last year was Indonesia. No one's mentioned the role of Indonesia last year. What is the focus that Indonesia managed? And we're discussing exactly Mekong Basin, if you'd like to approach conservative forest basin. Okay, so my feeling is that we need to come in this debate, make sure what are the new arrangements and how we should approach the challenges of multilateralism, how multilateralism should influence these new arrangements of countries, based on solutions, not only based on problems. Because what's happened in COP27 was exactly this. The side debates and the side outcomes, it's absolutely different what's happened into the negotiation rooms. Fernanda knows this, such as I. So I think that this is one point very important to be considering. Why also? Because when you go into scientific knowledge, when you go into the geopolitical arrangements, and you try to discuss, you're looking for, you need to discuss, must discuss planetary crisis, you go into some concepts that must be revealed, like sovereignty. Okay, how we are prepared to discuss sovereignty, not based on Madrid Treaty, but based on the 21st century, and how indeed we are prepared to connect the dots, for example, considering the Security Council and the Economic and Social Development Commission in the United Nations. Why is discussing this? And this is the real world, okay, where we took decisions, etc., etc. We will take decisions, etc., etc. So my feelings is that we should, Adriana, I know that you summarize everything, and Fernanda, try to identify, like trade, what's happened today, the debate in WTO, what are the new requirements for international trade when you go into this issue, and we have, for example, unilateral decisions for other countries that would like to establish some new concepts and new approach without knowing exactly the impacts on the economies, on the social development of developing countries. Innovative proposals, let's remember what President Lula mentioned in Sharm el-Sheikh. He proposed an alliance of food producers countries to tackle food and food security and nutritional security, and also to come together, to bring together Global South. So as a concrete proposal, can you imagine the challenges of a country like Brazil to bring together India and the United States and China, everything, because we're looking for to address hunger in the world, and also markets, trade, climate change, adaptation, because this is part of the equation of the game. So my feeling here is not to provoke you and to provoke myself, because everyone that knows me like to provoke a lot. I think that when you go into Global South, Adriana, and I like too much this panel, the role of the Global South, we need to understand how Global South will propose or share solutions, but how we will propose ourselves to come together, consider political and economic arrangements. If you're not able to do this, okay, we have the old way, the political old way to approach the things. And this is not enough. And even consider what's the role of the Global South into the new multilateralism system. How Global South will operate or come into the Bretton Woods reform, but make sure, for example, in Brazil, we have BNDES, and our National Development Bank is so powerful. And also have the bank, BRICS Bank. Nobody discussed this here. What's happening in BRICS Bank? Okay? Be sure that when you go into the communities, not necessarily they dialogue with UN system community. And it's very important to understand these new dynamics, how the pieces are moving, who are behind the scenes, and the role of the government, but the role of the society. So my suggestion here that we need to have a new mindset in the Global South to propose to come together. And to also and my last comment, it's absolutely urgent to review the environmental governance in the United Nations systems. Absolutely, it's really a priority because it still have the things fragmented, okay, and it's impossible to trace concrete solutions without jump into another ecosystems, as they want to like this. And this means that we need to share the power, the political power in innovative ways. If not, I'm so sorry, it will be very, very difficult to move on, considering our needs, but also our capacities to change and to influence the world in this sense. Back to you, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Isabella, for putting this new mindset and to reminding us that we are not discussing South-South cooperation, and this has such potential. So I think those are very, very important points, and we would discuss forever, but I need to organize this a bit. Adriana has requested the floor. Then we have Richard. I would like to give it back to our panelists, including Dr. Scholz, for final words. But I would also like to encourage our youth colleagues, Marceli, Iago, others, to speak. We would like to hear from you also on this discussion. So over to you, Adriana. Let's see if we can manage to do that in 10 minutes around all of this that I mentioned, but we start with you and then Richard.
Thank you. I have a question for Ambassador Hussain, and it's also piggybacking on Isabella's comments. Once upon a time, the Global South, the developing countries were able to come together and to put forth major proposals for systemic reform within the UN system. The results varied, but UNCTAD resulted out of that effort. The proposal for the new economic international order was later blocked, but it was a very substantive proposal based on diagnosis of common problems among very diverse countries. The Global South as a whole was very influential in the development of Agenda 2030 and in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, in part thanks to people like Isabella. What we find now is that the South is extremely fragmented, and that with exceptions, the G77, the non-aligned movement, are unable to come together in a very constructive way. Mostly they adopt defensive positions. Last night we talked about some exceptions. So when we have to start to think historically and to consider the starting point for reform proposals. And with all respect, and I think there is some value to this agenda coming out of UN 75 and our common agenda, this was written by Irish and Germans within the Secretary General's office. The gatekeepers are from Canada and the United States. So there is a problem of legitimacy in this agenda leading up to the Futures Summit. So if we think about alternative starting points, one idea, and it's included in your packet, feel free to take a look at it if you like. You know, in CIPAL, we think what are other spaces to think about South-led. It's not about exclusion of the North, but how can proposals come out of the Global South, right? One idea is to have a second edition of the South Commission, which was chaired by Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and constituted a 2 to 3 year cycle of debates to have a diagnosis of common problems. We need to update this exercise. The report coming out of that commission is one of the most beautiful documents to ever come out of the United Nations. But it didn't receive enough attention because it was published the month that the Soviet Union collapsed. So our proposal is to have this process, a series of regional and transregional debates. Perhaps this debate could feed into that process, and then have reform proposals that really focus on the demands, both the historic demands, but also the current demands. Our common agenda doesn't touch on UN Security Council reform. You cannot have meaningful reform of the UN system without addressing the underlying geopolitical issues and the distribution of power. It's just not possible to tweak the system and call that meaningful reform. I'm very sorry. So whether or not you agree with the forms of proposal that are being put forth for Security Council reform, we have to address this issue. Ambassador Hussain, no pressure, but how can we strengthen the G77 or other spaces? I agree that the G20 has its role to play, but how can we come together as developing countries to be more constructive and less defensive in this reform agenda? Thank you.
So I think we hear from Richard, and then when we wrap up, you reply, because otherwise we'll run out of time. Sorry.
Great, and very brief question, because of course Adriana took my question for Ambassador Hussain. And I also want to mention, Isabella, I think we heard another vote. We heard another vote for environmental governance recommendation from this GPD being the new fourth pillar of the UN system. We know we have sustainable development, but we need to elevate this whole set of issues that we're looking at. On the question then for our two other panelists, Dr. Imme Scholz and Dr. Adam Day, in our next session, the breakout groups are asked to go deep on existing proposals under discussion in the COPs, and then this Our Common Agenda, which we've been making references the last 2 days. Specific question then for Adam, the emergency platform idea and the idea about repurposing the trusteeship council to deal with environmental stewardship and the global commons. Are these issues that you're fleshing out through the work of the high-level advisory board? And Dr. Imme Scholz, so glad you brought and reminded us about the presidencies of the G20, India currently, South Africa, Brazil. There's a proposal by Secretary General Guterres for a biennial summit for the world economy to bring the heads of the G20 together with the 174 countries who are not represented through the G20, meeting every 2 years. They talk about ECOSOC. Many of us think that should just be UNGA, High-Level General Assembly Week. Any thoughts on that proposal to bring greater coherence, but also fairness, justice to global economic governance linked to the environment?
Okay, so now I give the floor to the speakers here for final words and to answer to those questions. If my youth colleagues want to speak, because after all, we are discussing a system that will be leaving soon and they will be inheriting. So, yeah.
Do you want me to answer first?
Sorry?
I also have a question for the ambassador. So
Yeah, she has a question. So let's take that last question, and then we go
I'll be
to we go
quick.
here, and then you. Okay.
Thank you, guys. My name is Ana Eloise. I'm part of the Instituto Marielle Franco. And my question is for the ambassador, Thilmeeza Hussain. And like I live here in Recife, and like Recife, I know that the Maldives are also suffering with the rise of the sea level. And like Imelza Scholz told us, no decision will be successful if it is not aligned with human rights and local context. So I'd like to ask you, how are the Maldives dealing with bringing marginalized peripheral communities, youth, and the most affected people to the center of the decision making? If there are spaces for them. Here in Brazil, for example, we have a few councils for those people, but they don't have like any binding power. So I wanted to know how you guys are dealing with this, with bringing the most marginalized to the center of the decision-making decisions, hearing them, hearing their voices. And I really want to know what's your opinion about the role of the international spaces, the international communities, the Global North communities in this? Thank you, guys.
Okay, so now let's get answers to those questions. And Ambassador, you have a very easy job, very easy questions for you.
I'll start with the last question, I think. So Maldives is a very young democracy. We became a democratic country not too long ago, and we're still working on strengthening democracy. But in our efforts to strengthen democracy, we also see one of the key pillars is the engagement of the civil society, strengthening civil society, youth engagement, empowerment of women. So we have been spending a lot of resources. We've started a decentralization project under the bill that was passed in the parliament recently. So we have now island councils, atoll councils, and the election took place a couple of years ago, and the newly elected atoll councils and island councils are actually very young people in our atoll council and island councils. And we are spending a lot of resources in capacity building of these people, and we also have a youth community that is very politically active and engaged, who has been instrumental in bringing democracy to our country. And so in that way, I think Maldives is very fortunate, because we have people who are, the young democratic government is very open and transparent, but also very keen. It is also composed of people who have pushed the agenda for empowering women, youth engagement, freedom of speech, empowering the civil society. So these are areas where the young democratic government is paying a lot of attention. A lot of resources are being spent on in these areas. So I think in that way we are fortunate, but we have to also make sure that we continue to work in these areas. And Adriana's question, Security Council reform, yeah. So that as long as there are veto people, as long as the composition of the council is such that the veto power lies with those who are on the council who is not willing to give away the veto power, I think it's almost an impossible task to achieve. So I think we should go outside the Security Council and see what other reform mechanisms are important that can happen. And you mentioned G77. Yes, G77 is a very diverse group, and it's difficult to come to consensus and bring together the diverse group. But that being said, I think G77 has also been in some ways doing really good work also. For example, G77 was instrumental in getting the mandate for loss and damage fund established last year. So that is a big positive step forward. And for us, I think for developing countries, capital, financial flow, aligning the financial flow, when we are talking about good governance, global governance, reform of the international governance architectures, the most important reform we can bring is the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, the reform of the financial architecture, because capital is becoming more difficult for developing countries to secure, and what is available is at really high interest rates. And given the debt burden many developing countries are added with during the pandemic because of the social support we needed to do, we need to really examine the redesigning of the Bretton Woods institutions. And we need them to reflect the world that we live in today. We need financial flows to align with actions to address the planetary crisis. Mia Motley's proposal, I know, 2 more minutes, because I had more questions. Mia Motley, Prime Minister Motley's proposal is a forward-looking proposal that has very promising ideas using special drawing rights to fund climate action. I think this proposal merits serious thought and consideration. SIDS are pushing for a multidimensional vulnerability index to guide multilateral funds in providing funding to developing countries that takes full view of our vulnerabilities. So I think this is something which is important, because current measures is GDP per capita is too limiting to measure when it comes to assessing risks and aligning vulnerabilities.
Thank
so
you.
I'm not going to go into all the details. I know you're
We're
trying
5
to take the
minutes
floor
over
away
time already,
floor from me, but I think IFI's finance is the key in, but one last word. It's very, very, very depressing to sit next to a scientist who's giving us a reality check. That basically David here sitting next to me said, my country is doomed. At 1.5 degrees, my country is doomed, and we have only 7 years to achieve 1.5 degrees, right? So essentially the house is on fire, and we're all just like sloths sitting here and walking like sloths, because the urgency of the burning planet that we are in, I don't think any of us are really doing anything about it with the urgency with which we need to do, because we only have 7 years to save my country.
Yeah, and we have 7 minutes to finish the panel, but I think we got the message here, and I think the people from the other countries that can take action, please get this strong message from Ambassador Hussain. David, please, as quick as possible, final words, and then I'll go to Dr. Scholz and Adam.
So with that, I'll then pick up from what Ambassador Thilmeeza just said, and that's about the voice of the South and equity in these processes. And I think this equity dimension is now front and center in front of us. It has been for a long time, but acting on it has been challenging. I think where we addressing the 3 things we need to address with finance and actions. So one is mitigation, which is about limiting change. Second one is adaptation, which is coping with change. And the third is loss and damage, which is compensation for excess or destructive change. And now that those 3 things have been accepted in the climate sphere, I think they apply to biodiversity as well. And they can be used to add up the responsibilities for current and future actions and the appropriate roles of actors as well. So for example, of course, we can add up carbon very easily, and we're doing that now. We can add up biodiversity in the future, and we're doing that increasingly successfully to see where the debt is. And the debt is from north to south. It's not from south to north. And I think if an actor has a solution, such as a carbon sink, the role of that actor in the negotiations needs to reflect that role that they have and what they have to offer to the table and the demands that can be put on the negotiations in this multilateral space. So I think really understanding how we can use this science to really change the debate is really important. The last thing I'll say is just very briefly, we're talking about sort of the global environmental governance and responding to planetary crises. I think from the experience of the Earth Commission, this is some work that I'm doing with the Global Challenges Foundation at the moment, is that I see there being two key functions, and one is the diagnosis of where we're going, and this is something that the Earth Commission has done, and I just presented that. And I think there's a role there for the existing institutions and perhaps for a networked, very responsive expert groups that focus on key elements in the Earth system, such as the cryosphere or ice sheets or the Amazon basin or coral reefs and coastal ecosystems, so that we really use the strength of the institutions we have, the IPCC and IPBES and others, but we also build a responsiveness that is much more representative as well of the places where these things are, where these crisis points are housed. And that's separate from the responses. The responses really perhaps need to sit in, say, we've heard about a Global Resilience Council, there's a global environmental organization being proposed. Again, building on the institutions that we have, but then we need to deal with the nuances of responses in different places. And these two functions perhaps need to be separate, but linked together, of course, and very nimble networked organizations making the most of functionalities, digital communications, things that we have now.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Scholz, there was a question for you by Richard. And any final comments? As quick as possible, please.
Yes, yes. Thank you again for having me at this important meeting. And it was really very interesting to listen to the participants from the audience. Maria João and Isabella and Adriana is what I recall most. And yes, Indonesia did a good job, I think, in the G20 presidency. But putting together the opportunities of the G20, the positioning of the Global South as a reform power in multilateral cooperation, and it's trying to answer to Adriana's question. I think Isabella gave part of the answer. It's saying focus on the strengths and what you have to contribute as a solution, and not only look at the problems like the rabbit looks at the snake, which is going to eat it. And I think that the G20 presidencies offer an opportunity, because you might know that there is always an ample participatory process connected to it, through think tanks, through civil society, and foundations also, and the academies, the national academies of science. And this allows for having broader discussions which could help to start a debate on what would it need to bring the South together, and what would it be that it wants. And I think it is important there to have exactly the debate on where to focus on institutions, on coordination, on having rules respected, and what is the relation then to finance. The point the ambassador was emphasizing so much. Probably we cannot choose for one, but I think having a look at the sources, the resources the Global South brings into this, and I think South-South cooperation is one, and deal with them, discuss them also in the engagement groups as much as in the G20, to make clear what their advantages and their innovative capacity really is universally. I think that is important, and I would recall what Adam said, make a real value proposal to the North, because without changing the North and without changing the setup of development cooperation as we have it now, we won't move forward. And I think we need more universal transformative proposals for that as well. And the Global Public Investment Initiative is one we could maybe use here. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for keeping to the time. So Adam, please, final words, comments.
Final 30 seconds. Richard, I'm going to willfully ignore your two questions and hopefully come back to them this afternoon. I want to pick up really on just one point by Adriana, which has to do with the distribution of power. And we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day, and he has a famous quote about the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. I don't think it bends naturally towards justice. It takes a lot of individual and group effort to bend it that way. And I'm struck at how accustomed and accepting we are globally of an extraordinary level of global inequality and unfairness. And it feels increasingly baked in, institutionalized, and difficult to solve via institutional fixes. And I think Adriana's point on the Security Council illustrates how unlikely it is to fix an institution like that in the short term. And part of the solution is market-based, as Juan Fernando pointed out, building in incentives. And part of it is institutional, as Ambassador Hussain talked about, reforming the Bretton Woods institutions. And part of it is normative, and a new generation of youth who won't accept these models. And when I talk about more distributed models of decision making and getting away from the mahogany table, that was a great point about mahogany, it's really meant to open space for those under 35 to have a greater stake in global governance and see their ideas reflected in there. So the only point I would add to David's great point about nimble and networked approaches, it would be nimble, networked, and inclusive to give individuals, citizens, young people, a more direct role in leading. And I actually think Adriana's proposal to have a South Center-led process is exactly the right type of connected, locally driven type of discussion that could lead to that. But what I would like to see is 10 years from now, rather than sitting around this table talking about environmental governance, young people are sitting around the decision-making table, wherever that happens to be, hopefully made out of something other than mahogany. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that our youth representatives that are here will have the opportunity to participate more in the afternoon. It was an honor to moderate such a rich panel, and it's probably the last time since I let the time run over so much. I don't think I'll be invited again, but thanks to Mayara and Adriana very much for the invitation. And I think we have great ideas and a great debate to follow on the next session. And in the afternoon, I'll give the floor to Mayara now because she wants to brief us on logistics and other information.
Thank you, Fernanda, for the great moderation and for all the panelists. So you probably noticed we're running 15 minutes late. So if we are going to shorten the coffee break a little bit. So we have 10 minutes for coffee break, but you're free to bring your coffee and food to your breakout room so we don't have to delay lunch by much. But yes, just feel free to get coffee and everything you need. It's just outside.